Hi everyone, we're going to talking about a bit of a doozy today. This is a copy of Defending Sin by Hans Madueme, published by Baker Academic. Thank you to Baker for sending me this for review. This is my honest take on the book, and I have quite a whirling reaction to this, as I'll get into. But I will take you through my typical format of the main idea of the book, the research behind it, the readability of the style, and then just my reactions to it. So my reactions are going to be quite complex, as I think we'll see. But I think this is a book that's worth looking at if you're interested in the topic at hand. So let me dive in. Okay, so the main idea of this book, Defending Sin, it would be giving this book way short shrift to summarize it this way, I think. But in a way, this is a really bracing and rigorous defense of young Earth creationism, actually. Which I didn't realize that's what it was so much when I grabbed it. It was recommended to me by someone I really respect, and as a book that addressed questions of science and faith in a way that not many books do, and so that's all I knew about it when I went in, and wow, I was really really pushed and prodded and challenged by this one. Anyways, I'm getting a little ahead of myself. The main idea of this book is it is a response to scientific challenges to scriptural authority, and so the book is it's set up in three kind of sections. In the first section of the book, he lays out his kind of core concerns about the ways that Christians and Christian traditions have rethought, or in his idea, maybe capitulated to scientific challenges and too quickly maybe caved and rethought core doctrines, or at least traditional doctrines that they derive from scriptures in light of scientific challenges. His concern is really there. And actually, to that end, I'm going to read two quotes that I think get at his concern. This is all in the first section of the book. He lays out in a couple chapters what his kind of theological, doctrinal, philosophical concerns are. So on page 69, he says, "The problem is that if every new conflict between science and theology is always resolved in favor of science, then we will keep revising our doctrinal formulations, and those revisions will keep undermining the reality depicting nature of Scripture." Another quote farther on page 82. He says, "On what grounds can Christians be generally accepting of scientific conclusions while also reserving the right to demur in cases of conflict with doctrinal claims?" So that's a really good question. And those two quotes, it's just two little quotes that I pulled out to try to represent some of his core concerns. And he really has deep level concerns about this relationship between scientific findings and historical findings as related to archaeology and geology and all that stuff, and then our understanding of deriving truths and doctrines and ideas from Scripture itself. That the relationship between these two things is really what he's driving at in this book. And then the back 2/3 of the book, the other two sections, are a constructive theological project that he titles Protology and Hamartiology. So he's putting forward, having laid out his concerns, then he puts forward some deeply careful, rigorous theological proposals about protology, meaning doctrine of kind of the first things. So like his case for why we need to recover a robust doctrine of not just a doctrine of creation, but a doctrine of why creation was good at one point, like pre-fall, a kind of strong pre-fall protology. And then the third part is hamartiology, or doctrine of sin, and then going from there, how we need to kind of recover, in his view, a really robust understanding of the incursion of sin into the world and how that played out. And he thinks on both accounts, he doesn't think that the scientific kind of evolutionary story findings, current kind of understanding of evolution, he doesn't think evolution adequately deals with those two things that he would say are, I think I'm being fair to him, he would say are really robustly put forward in Scripture as kind of non-negotiables for the Christian understanding of the world and Christian understanding of God and salvation and soteriology. Like, he thinks that this protology, hamartiology kind of planks are that important that we need to recover them in the face of, or over and against, kind of the status quo of kind of scientific understanding of the history of the world and history of humanity. And he thinks they're that important that we need to hold to them despite the pressure, and he would admit the overwhelming kind of preponderance of evidence all around us from the scientific community about, the age of humanity, the development of humanity evolutionarily. Basically he's trying to recover a really deep, rigorous understanding of the world was good at one point. There was a pre-fall good state of things. And then through the specific acts of Adam and Eve, which he does take to be historical people, a historical couple, they gave specific acts that gave way for the introduction of sin and death into that good state. That is the fall in Christian kind of traditional terms. And we need to recover all of that, even though evolution would say that's not how it played out. So yeah, that's my attempt to wrangle the main idea of this one. This is a head-spinning one. It's really deep. But that's what's going on in defending sin. That's what he's putting forward. So real quickly, I'll go through these next two areas. The research behind it. One of the many things I was impressed with this book is the research. It is really outstandingly researched, honestly. To my great pleasure, to my great joy, it is really well researched in the area, all the areas he addresses. I mean, he is scientifically and theologically trained. So he is very conversant with all the science he talks about, down to molecular level science, to theoretical science, to geology, all of it. He understands it, and he understands the scientific challenges that are kind of pushing on his own view of things. So this is not a straw man, kind of polemic on any direction. His research is also very strong on the biblical side of things and the history of Christian interpretation side of things as well. He gets more into the history of interpretation than he does into just like rote or strong exegesis. But it's very strong. Like he really has done a massive amount of reading and study, and he understands it. And that's what's really important to me when I read books like this that are like, I can tell that the writer understands the arguments they're interacting with. They're fluent in it. They're conversant in it. They're not just, like I said, putting up straw men to knock down. And so his research is really pretty extraordinary, to be really honest. I've read a good number of books on faith and science kind of interaction and dialogue, and this one, in terms of its research at least, is up there with the best in my reading. And then, okay, the readability before I get to my reactions. The readability is a little complicated on this one because it is... I read this one quickly because I was so just challenged and intrigued by it. I cannot say it's the most readable book stylistically page for page because it is, I mean, Baker Academic is the academic imprint, and it is a little bit slower. It's a little bit crunchier in terms of progressing through. I was constantly looking at the footnotes to see where he was getting things from or to get deeper into certain contentions he would make. So it's not the smoothest read. Doesn't go down the easiest. I was also personally deeply challenged by this. I'll get into this in a minute, but I was not coming into this from a young earth perspective at all. So I found it very challenging in a good way, but also in a way that, it made the reading experience just a little crunchy. I don't know what other word to put on it. So I'm kind of equivocating on my readability point here. It's not like hard to understand or obtuse or overly academic, but it is careful, very rigorously researched and argued, like I already said. And so it's not the easiest read. I guess that's what I'll say. Okay, and then finally, try to summarize my reactions here. So, I'll admit, my thumbnail on this is a little clickbaity. Did this convince me to be a young earth creationist? No, it didn't. But I have to say, this is far and away the best defense representation of a quote-unquote young earth view that I've ever read, or probably am likely to read. I think, I can't imagine a better representation of a young earth view. I just don't see how one could be written. Maybe it could be, but maybe that's a broad statement. But what made this so good and challenging was a couple things. I already talked about the research. I glowed about the research. Like, first of all, that was fantastic. So he knows what he's writing about. He also basically says in the book, like, he kind of comes right out a few times and he says, I know the preponderance of scientific evidence is against my perspective on this, and so be it. Here's the reasons why I'm still, holding to this view. I really respect that way of arguing in this kind of area of thought. But another thing I loved about this book that puts it above most other kind of books about this topic is he locates the conflict correctly, in my view. He locates it correctly. He locates it in more of a philosophical register. He locates it in epistemology. He locates it in, like, how do we know what to trust? Do we trust truth revealed in Scripture? Do we trust truth revealed in science? And as those quotes I read earlier indicate, are we a little too quick to capitulate to scientific truth and rethink scriptural ideas when, in his view, and I think he really pushed me on this actually, and this I found myself challenged and maybe shifted a bit in my views. He argues pretty convincingly that, like, if anything, there's a fallibility to science, and the history of scientific findings shows us that there's a fallibility to it and a rethinking of it and a revising of it. And should we be so quick to kind of cave on our traditional doctrinal ideas when there's a very clear fallibility to scientific findings that we shouldn't be so quick to maybe put like a timeless trust in? That's a really, really challenging argument that I think is very worth hearing and interacting with in this whole debate. So he pushed me in some key areas. He made me rethink some things in some key areas that I found, it's not a great feeling necessarily to be challenged at that depth, but it's also why I read. It's why we should read, because we should be stretched and we should be poked and prodded and we should be exposed to other views. That's why I love reading so much. And so from that angle, this book is like one of, it really shows why I love reading, and it reminded me of the importance of being challenged and kind of reading outside of what you'd maybe be quick to jump to. So why am I not convinced ultimately? Well, gosh, ultimately, I still think his case might make a little bit too much out of a few planks on the scriptural side of things. So the genealogies, for example, he has really good arguments about why he takes the genealogies. And so a lot of his argument actually rests, I should have said this earlier, a lot of his argument rests more on the historicity of the genealogies in Genesis 5 and 11 than it does on like the case and the presentation in Genesis 1, 2, and 3, which is also another interesting nuance to this argument. And so he makes a pretty part of, then he backs up his beliefs why he thinks those genealogies are historical and historically trustworthy. And I think he makes a really strong case. I'm just still not entirely sure if that's right. And I'm bumping up against some of his other planks. He talks about like a dogmatic kind of assertion with his understanding of Scripture in those chapters. And I know I'm just not lining up with a couple of his core planks of kind of the constellation of views that he puts out there, but I just wasn't quite convinced, I suppose, of that specific aspect of his argument, and therefore a lot flows out of it. And that's another thing that makes me a little bit, I don't know if cagey or worried or nervous is the right about his argument, is that it does feel like it's really logical and it rests on a lot of these planks that rest on each other, and it is dogmatic, it is systematic, and it is careful, and so I have a little bit of a queasy relationship with overly systematized kind of plank on plank on plank arguments when it comes to these things, where they might be a little bit too rigid. And so that was another takeaway I had from this book. So anyways, I don't want to harp too much on those little quibbles I had, because here's what I will say. Because he, I think, correctly identified where the real conflict lies in that epistemological register, I was really challenged at some of the assumptions that I've been carrying, frankly, around this whole conversation, and he really pushed hard on some of those assumptions I've carried about the evolutionary progress, about, I've rethought my own understanding of scientific fallibility because of the stuff that he talked about. I've rethought some of my own presuppositions about what Genesis is trying to do. And this is really important. I think more than anything, this book is a ringing success in the constructive theology he puts forward about protology and hamartiology. I think this is my biggest positive takeaway, is that I really have been pushed to rethink my understanding of the importance of a doctrine of sin. What is sin? Where does it come from? How does it exist in our world? And how important is it for it to be linked with a first things understanding of, like, was there a state in which sin did not exist at one point? How is that important for our understanding of redemption and what God is fixing and has fixed and has promised to fix one day fully? Those things, man, the fact that he foregrounds those things is so valuable, and I loved thinking through those issues and the way that he frames them in this chapter. And so that really shifted kind of my energy and my priorities in kind of this whole science, evolution, scripture, history, contentious arena of thought. And even though I haven't been converted to young Earth creationism for some of those arguments that I alluded to, and for other points that I don't have time to get into, I haven't been converted, so to speak. I was really impacted by this book. I'm really glad I read it. I'm extremely glad he wrote it. I think this is an important book in the conversation. And if you are super anti-young Earth creationism, if you have some like PTSD from a fundamentalist upbringing around that whole topic, I would still encourage you to read this because the way he talks about it is wildly different from almost anything ever I've seen. It's extremely smart, extremely well read. It's also pretty gentle. It's not out there swinging polemic clubs. I just think it's very valuable. I think this is a really, really excellent book to kind of put on the shelf, so to speak, with all other science and faith books. Even if you don't ultimately agree with him at the end, man, oh man, it's really worth wrestling with what he's putting out there. So thank you to Hans Madueme and Baker for publishing Defending Sin. Really fantastic read, really worth spending some time with. And thank you for taking a few minutes to watch.